November. The Phi Alpha Pi house continued to be busy in the month of November. Mrs. C, who had not gone crazy decorating for Halloween, came out with endless Thanksgiving decorations. Marie had to fight with Mrs. C about the appropriateness of also hanging Christmas decorations on November 1st. Lizbeth felt like she was waiting for things to happen, for Lydia to gloat at how she had planned such an amazing Halloween party, for Mrs. C to celebrate Jane's relationship with Charlie, for Jane to start spending time with Charlie again, and to hear from Jorge about his absence. Instead, the sisters were busy writing papers and studying for midterms. None of the events Lizbeth anticipated actually happened.
The only change came from Colin, who became clingy.
He walked Lizbeth to and from the one class they had together. He came over every night for dinner with his mother, and made a point of finding Lizbeth to talk to her. Colin finally found her at the library, showed up during her shifts, and was asked by a librarian to leave Lizbeth alone during work. Lizbeth ignored her irritation with Jorge, Will, and Colin. She turned her attention to her presentation for Dr. Bennett's class. She had spent all semester preparing for a discussion about Gamergate and sexism in tech.
I want to introduce you to the Women and Technology group on campus. They have a small reception tonight. I'm going to come by the house at about 7 to walk over with you. I don't like the idea of you walking alone after dark,
Dr. Bennett said as she set up her presentation on the computer. I'd love to meet them. I think I can get over on my own, though, Lizbeth said.
Your house is on my way over, and it's on the other side of campus,
Dr. Bennett said, and started his introduction. After her professor's introduction, Lizbeth began her prepared slideshow. She had a total of 6 slides if you counted the opening and closing placeholder slides. She started by sharing statistics of the actual gender divide within tech, including video gaming and Wikipedia. Next, she covered the timeline of Gamergate and the key players, from Zoe Quinn, the video game developer whose game and harassment seemed to jumpstart the conflict, to Anita Sarkeesian, the feminist media critic who created a video series about tropes and objectification of women in video games. From there, she explained the media's portrayal, including the basics of the gaming journalism ethics commentary and the coordination of harassment. Finally, she moved into what she called the ripples and impact of Gamergate. She focused on positive effects like beginning to show the world how women are treated online, but mentioned a few that were negative, like the backlash against Twitter's handling of harassment through their platform. She had worked hard to make sure she didn't say which she felt were good or bad, but she hoped her audience would critically evaluate each of them. Her classmates scribbled their notes as she spoke. She suspected they were writing more about her presentation style than her content. Are there any questions? Lizbeth asked as she brought up the last slide. Colin's hand shot up before Lizbeth finished speaking.
I am concerned about your representation of what happened. I followed the situation as a Reddit user and video game player. You seem to be under the impression that this was an attack on women.
It was used as an excuse to attack women. Any woman who dared to speak up found herself harassed. Famous tech women found themselves harassed for merely speaking up about gender bias in tech.
Actually, it was about ethics in gaming journalism,
Colin said. Lizbeth took a deep breath and held back the feminist rant forming in her brain. What, in your opinion, was the ethical problem in gaming journalism? Lizbeth asked.
Reviewers were biased in favor of subpar, so-called diverse video games.
As opposed to video games where women are only represented as unplayable characters who are either virgin or whore?
Actually, there are playable women characters. In a game of 15 playable characters, there may be one woman, and she is hypersexualized, said a voice in the back.
Lizbeth looked back to see Will sitting up and leaning forward at his desk.
Most gamers are male. They want to play male characters, Colin said, turning around.
Actually, Will said,
if you paid attention to the very first slide, you would have seen that in 2014, nearly half of video game players were women. I'm sure that has only increased since. That's not the point. The point is that men treat women as invasive aliens in tech. They are allowed to play. They just have to be able to handle the way men act, Colin said.
Actually, Lizbeth said, interrupting the two men, this is an example of my point. You both sit there and mansplain to me, each other, and the rest of the class about what I mean when I'm perfectly capable of explaining myself. Women are expected to deal with and prevent attacks from men, be they physical, sexual, emotional, or intellectual. Men don't have to curb their behavior to be more appropriate. This is nothing new, just a new medium. Not all men attack women, Colin said. Almost every woman in the class groaned in response. No, but let's use an extreme example. Let's say you get drunk at a party. As a result, you do something stupid and someone gets hurt. Are you to blame? Lizbeth asked.
No, I was drunk, Colin said.
Now, let's say it was a woman and she gets drunk at a party and gets hurt. Is she to blame?
Well, she shouldn't have gotten drunk.
This is the problem. Women are expected to avoid situations that will get them harassed. They are told to expect harassment in life as a given.
They are told to stay out of tech because it is hostile.
Men are allowed to behave as they wish in any situation. We can take this back to historical religious worship. Why did the Jews separate men and women during worship?
I don't know. Why?
Colin asked.
Because women distract men, who can't be held responsible for our actions, Wil said from the back of the room.
Exactly. Women are tired of having to live their lives in fear and accommodating the male whim. They want to see themselves represented in the media they consume. Not only that, they want to be represented accurately. It's what we all want, no matter sex, gender, race, or heritage. The tech industry is a microcosm of something going on intentionally. What we have learned since is that it's not limited to the needs of the other, but the reactions of the dominant. The push from one has caused an equally strong reaction from the other.
It was only about ethics in gaming journalism, Colin said. Well, this has certainly been a lively discussion, Dr. Bennet said before Lizbeth could respond.
Lizbeth was irritated after the presentation. She spent the afternoon in her room, quietly working on her thesis and other class assignments.
Lizbeth!
There you are, Mrs. C said from her doorway. Lizbeth looked up at the woman. Do you need something? She asked.
Are you coming to dinner?
Lizbeth looked at the window and saw it was now dark out. The clock on her computer showed it was just after 6. Dr. Bennet is coming by at 7 to take me out. Well, you should eat something now. We're having an officers' dinner in my rooms. You said you were coming. Lizbeth didn't remember this, but didn't have the energy to argue. She followed Mrs. C down to her rooms and found everyone, including Colin, at the table. The only empty chair was between Colin and Mrs. C.
Lizbeth, I'm hoping we can continue our conversation from class.
No, Lizbeth said, sitting down and putting food on her plate.
Well, this may be my last chance to sit around this table with such lovely ladies. My mentor, Miss Catherine DeBerg, has arranged my spring internship, but it begins right after Thanksgiving. I'm going to be moving to Gardner in Massachusetts next week. I've made all the arrangements with my professors.
Lizbeth, tired of hearing about Colin's internship plans, tuned him out and thought about all the things she had to do herself. From the gossip she had heard in the department,
Colin's professors were only too happy to allow him to miss the rest of their classes and just turn in papers.
Most of the professors on campus had recordings of their lectures on password-protected class web pages to help students refresh their knowledge. Colin was going to watch those, do his assignments, and get his grades.
Lizbeth, did you hear me?
Colin said, breaking into her train of thought. Excuse me?
I'd like to speak with you after dinner.
Professor Bennet is on his way over to walk with me to an event.
I can join you.
This is a private event that relates to my thesis proposal. I can't allow that.
Well, maybe we can speak privately now.
Good idea, darling, Mrs. C said, and ushered the other women out of the small dining room in her rooms. Lizbeth was confused and turned to Jane. Jane's smile was full of pity. Lizbeth panicked when she realized Colin was on one knee. Wait, no, Jane, Marie, Lydia, come back! Whatever Colin has to say can be said in front of everyone, Lizbeth called after her sorority sisters.
Lizbeth, you are so kind to want everyone to share in this wonderful moment, Colin began. It is one of the qualities I like best about you. You are so inclusive and modest. Be assured, your friends are all aware of my intentions."
"Really? Everyone is aware?"
"My mother assured me that this is what everyone wants for us. I've wanted this since I first met you. I'm glad I was allowed to spend so much time with you, even though you have been so busy this semester. The more time I spend with you, the more convinced I am that you are my ideal wife. I want you to marry me, join me in Gardner, and use the time there to work on your thesis and take care of us. You will never want for anything, as long as we are together. You will never have to work."
Lizbeth was speechless for a brief moment, and then broke out in laughter. "You can't be serious," she managed to say to Colin.
"Oh," Colin said, looking confused. "I am quite serious. My mother insists, and Miss de Bourgh agrees, that I need to find a wife right away. I have found their advice sound when they agree. Mother feels I need to have someone to help with, manage my life while I focus on my academics and future. She thinks someone who is supportive but understands my work is ideal. She said someone like you would be a perfect match. I've told Miss de Bourgh all about you, your academic interests, and your work in the sorority. I've told her how modest you are, how hard-working, how you have the job at the library to help pay your tuition because your family can't help you. I know I will be the best husband for you. I will provide for you so that you never have to work. You can stay home, build a happy home for us, and raise our children. Your family would be helped by my mentor as well. She has assured me of that."
Nothing Colin said made any sense to Lizbeth. How could anyone think she was the perfect woman for Colin? "What makes you think that I want to build a home and have children? What makes you think my family needs to be helped?"
"Lydia explained everything about why you need to work. I completely understand. What else do women want if not to be taken care of and to have children surrounding them?"
Lizbeth sat dumbstruck. What had Lydia told people?
"You will move with me to Gardner. Lydia has assured me she will make sure the leadership transition here goes smoothly. We will be married as soon as possible, and you can finish your degree online the same way I will. I'm sure Dr. Bennett and your other professors will be more than happy to give you the same arrangement they have given me."
"Colin, you act as though I have said yes to your proposal."
"Why wouldn't you?"
"Rest assured, Colin, I'm the last person you want as a wife. I'd never make you happy. First, my goal in life doesn't involve a loveless marriage or children. Second, I work in the library because I enjoy it there, not because I need the money. Third, I'm not especially modest or kind. 4, no, my professors would not allow me to walk away from classes and turn in assignments from Massachusetts. You have no idea who I am, and I in no way want to marry you."
"Lizbeth, I know that modern women like to play hard to get. I know you are trying to make me work for your affection to make sure I'm sincere. My increasing number of business contacts, now including the Darcy family, will increase your position in society. I'll have political connections. You would know the president because you are married to me."
"Do you know the president?"
"No, not yet, but I will some day. I am sure of that."
"Would you believe me if I told you I do know past presidents of this country?"
"Nonsense."
"Colin, I'm going to say this one more time. I have no desire to marry you. I don't have the desire to spend any more time with you." With that, Lizbeth got up, left the room, and returned to her bedroom. She was angry and said nothing to anyone. She was mad at Lydia and Mrs. C for thinking this was something she wanted. She was mad at Jane and Charlotte for not warning her. She grabbed a bag and left the house. She sat on the porch and waited for Dr. Bennett to come by. It was dark, but she could see him walking up the street. "Lizbeth," she heard Mrs. C yell as she walked outside. "What do you want from me?" "You get back in there and you accept my son's proposal." Colin was not far behind his mother.
"Mother, no. If Lizbeth is this stubborn and foolish, then she is not the right woman for me."
"Nonsense! She's perfect for you, and she will say yes. Look, I see your professor. I know he can talk some sense into Lizbeth." Lizbeth wanted to laugh.
"What's going on here?" Dr. Bennett said when he got to the sorority house gate.
"Oh, Dr. Bennett, I'm glad you're here," Mrs. C said. "I'm Colin's mother, and the house mother for Phi Alpha Pi. My son has just proposed marriage to Lizbeth, and she has refused him. Talk some sense into her." Dr. B looked at each person standing before him.
"Lizbeth,
he finally said. "I fear your life will be terrible if you don't make the right choice. Clearly, Mrs. Collins will be very angry with you if you refuse her son. On the other hand, I will fail you on principle and refuse to let you finish your thesis if you agree to marry him. Which is more important, your own academic goals or some random lady's personal desires for you?" "There was never a decision to make," Lizbeth said as she got up, grabbed her bag, and walked to the gate. "I think you made the right choice," Dr. Bennet said as they walked away. Life at the sorority house was tense for a week after Colin's proposal. The board members fought about how to respond to Mrs. C's manipulations on her son's behalf. Showing up at a non-sorority-sponsored event and meddling in the lives of some sisters was more than Lizbeth and Marie could take. Lydia was quick to defend their house mother. The two had become surprisingly close in the past 2 months. Lizbeth couldn't figure out why Lydia liked Mrs. C. Jane felt there were other issues to consider. She had learned there had been no other applicants for the job, and they needed someone to help manage the house. She thought it was best to just let it go for the year. In the end, they couldn't reach a decision, and Mrs. C got to stay longer. Lizbeth was so angry that she spent all her free time at the library or local coffee shops working on her assignments. "Colin proposed to me," Charlotte said one afternoon when she found Lizbeth sitting at the campus Starbucks reading. Lizbeth looked up to see that her friend seemed unusually anxious. She was picking at her cuticles and breathing deeply as if to keep calm. "Excuse me? Please tell me you said no. You don't need to marry anyone right now, let alone Colin Collins." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "I said yes." "What? Lizbeth, I'm not like you. I don't have a trust fund and wealthy parents. I don't work for the joy of working. I don't have all the benefits of wealth and privilege. I won't go back to Flint after graduation. I won't take some mindless job just to survive. I want to make art, and I have to think of my future. If that means I have to marry Colin to get that, then I will do what I need to do." Lizbeth was taken aback by Charlotte's anger. She had never thought deeply on their different situations. It wasn't like Charlotte was, raging about race, class, and privilege. "Charlotte, if you want to go to New England and be with him, you don't need to marry him. Go to graduate school and teach art. You're smart and independent. He is his mother's creation and oblivious to what the people around him want," Lizbeth said. "I don't want to go to graduate school. I don't want to go in debt just to teach. I want to make art. You're one to talk about being oblivious. You don't see anything beyond your own world view. You don't see the impact you have on choices. You have more influence on people than you realize. Why do you think the sorority wanted you to be president? Meanwhile, you don't see that there is a guy who's crazy about you. What are you talking about? You only see and hear what you want to see. It's time for you to look at the world beyond your privilege. It's time for you to realize that not all of us want the same thing as you. If you want a patron, I think you could do better than Colin Collins. You may not find Colin tolerable, but I enjoy spending time with him. He asked you first because his mother insisted. He asked me because he likes me too. I'm going into this with open eyes, and I know what to expect. I'll be fine. Charlotte, this is a huge mistake.
You don't need to marry him.
I didn't come here so you could change my mind. I've thought about this, and it's the best decision for me. I came to tell you that I'm leaving with him at the end of the week. Miss de Bourgh has a pretty cottage on her property and has set it up for us. I spoke with my professors and have the same arrangement as Colin for the semester. What are you going to do in the spring? I have some online classes I can take and an independent study. It may take me a bit longer, but finishing the degree isn't really a priority anymore. I don't need a degree to paint. You're in a 1960s bubble. Women don't give up things to get married. You can make art and take care of yourself. Well, then I'm sorry you feel I'm letting you and all feminists down. Charlotte got up and walked away. Lizbeth was devastated when she wasn't invited to Charlotte and Colin's quiet civil ceremony a few days later. She didn't get to say goodbye before they left town. She kept playing through it all again in her mind, and remembered something Will had said to her about misunderstanding people. Was that really her flaw?
She thought she was so observant of people.
She used all these skills she had learned in class to listen to what people said and the way they acted. What was she missing? She started paying attention to the closest person to her, Jane. Jane, Lizbeth said the night Charlotte left as they were trying to fall asleep. Lizbeth, do you want to be with Charlie? I do. Why are you taking things so slow? I don't know. I guess I'm scared. It doesn't matter. Caroline sent an email and said they were going to be busy for the rest of the semester with the holidays and papers.
She doesn't think we can get together. Charlie has been really busy, too.
Have you talked to Charlie? Yeah, it's not a big deal. He doesn't seem to be very invested in the relationship. I think I was right to be cautious. I don't think he's the right one for me, Jane said with a sigh. Did I miss something? No, it just didn't happen. Are you sure? Yeah. What about you and Jorge? Lizbeth still hadn't heard from Jorge, despite a few calls, texts, and emails. She had gotten so frustrated and angry with him that she had given up on their relationship. It's clearly over. I don't know if he didn't come to the Halloween party because of Wil or something else, but he won't talk to me. I guess he wasn't that invested in our relationship either. That's too bad. Speaking of Wil, did you know his last name is Darcy? Lizbeth said. What? He's really Mr. Darcy? He told me on Halloween when he saw my costume. Jane and Lizbeth lay in their respective beds and laughed. Lizzie and Mr. Darcy, Jane said. Don't call me Lizzie. November 15th, 2:06 p.m. From Lizbeth to Charlotte. Subject, forgive me? Hi, I've been thinking about how things ended before you got married, and I'm sorry for the way I behaved and the things I said. It was wrong of me to forget that we come from different circumstances and that we see the world differently. I made it about me, and it wasn't. I miss you and wish I hadn't been so mean before you got married. I hope you can forgive me. L. November 15th, 3:30 p.m. From Charlotte to Lizbeth. Subject, read, forgive me. Hi, you are always going to be forgiven. You should know that. I'm sorry I was so harsh about your response to my engagement announcement. I had come ready to be defensive. I wish you had been at the wedding too. My parents asked about you. Things are really good so far. Distance from his mother has softened Colin a bit. Maybe we can grab coffee over Thanksgiving. I'm not too far from your grandparents. C. November 15th, 5:14 p.m. From Lizbeth to Charlotte. Subject, read, forgive me. Really? Yes, let's plan something. I'm not sure what is going on yet. I mean, other than Thanksgiving. My dad decided to keep the restaurant open, so we are all going to have Thanksgiving dinner on Saturday night in Gardner.
There's a horse that needs to be ridden and spoiled.
I can't wait to see the cottage. Side note, when you left, you mentioned something about some guy who's crazy about me. What did you mean? L. November 16th, 6:26 p.m. From Charlotte to Lizbeth. Subject, read, forgive me. Hi, sorry it took me so long to get back to you.
Colin and I were talking about something. Why don't you come to us for Thanksgiving?
This way you aren't bored while everything is closed. I think you'll find this place pretty interesting, and Miss de Berg fascinating. Don't worry about Mrs. C. She's with one of the other kids this Thanksgiving. She said she's giving us some space. You can come here on Wednesday and leave Saturday in time for dinner at your grandparents' house. C. November 17th, 8:01 a.m. From Lizbeth to Charlotte. Subject, read, forgive me. Hi. Talked to people in Boston, and I think I'll take you up on the offer. You didn't answer my question about the guy. Am I missing something? L. November 17th, 11:59 a.m. From Charlotte to Lizbeth. Subject, read, forgive me. Hi. We will talk about it in person. It isn't something for email. C. Charlotte met Lizbeth at the airport on Wednesday. They made a quick stop at Lizbeth's parents' brownstone in Boston before driving out to Gardner. The cottage Colin and Charlotte lived in was small but quaint, and the perfect place for them to start. It was an older building, probably servants' quarters once upon a time, but the inside had been modernized. There were 2 floors and a finished basement. The first floor had an open floor plan with kitchen, dining room, and den. The decor was ultra-modern in grays and metallic. Lizbeth knew Charlotte had had no say in any of it.
Charlotte's taste was far more eclectic and comfortable.
The 2 bedrooms on the second floor were also very modern.
The guest room felt like a hotel room with inoffensive art on the walls and pristine linens on the bed.
The dark wood of the furniture was comfortable for Lizbeth, but she imagined Charlotte would prefer an old, beat-up, cast-iron bed draped in colorful quilts from Haiti. The bedrooms were the same size, each with an ensuite bathroom. Catherine de Bourgh was very kind to not only update the cottage for us, but to decorate it, Charlotte said when she brought Lizbeth to the guest room. The basement was where Lizbeth saw touches of Charlotte. The basement wasn't a proper basement.
The small cottage was built into a hill.
While the west side had no windows, the east side had floor-to-ceiling French doors that opened to the back door and let in beautiful natural morning light. Colin had made his wife a small art studio space, and Charlotte was already sketching and planning projects.
There was a chair in a corner that Lizbeth recognized from the apartment she and Charlotte had shared with Jane the year before. Charlotte had designed fabric to cover it. Lizbeth remembered splitting the cost of printing the fabric
for Jane as Charlotte's Christmas present that year. Charlotte had recovered the chair, and it had become her favorite spot to sketch from.
The table had obviously been painted by Charlotte to go with the chair.
On the side table sat some of Charlotte's sketches of landscapes. Lizbeth had spent much of her childhood on the North Shore of Massachusetts, and knew Charlotte would have plenty to sketch and paint for years. In the spring, I'm going to start gardening again, Charlotte said. My father and I did it when I was a kid. It was one of the few ways we ate healthy food. Miss de Bourgh has some ideas on what will grow best in this space and look the prettiest. Consider blueberries. They grow wonderfully out here. Also, an apple tree will give you more than you need. I'll keep that in mind. I want to have a summer English garden in the front, too. Just flowers everywhere coming up the walk. That would look wonderful against the stone. Lizbeth had to smile. She was glad to have her friend back. Lizbeth slept well that night. Colin had come home after Lizbeth and Charlotte went to bed. She had heard him talking as she read in her own room. She couldn't make out the words, but he had sounded excited. She hadn't bothered getting up to say hello. He would have plenty to say to her the next day.
Well, Lizbeth, isn't it just lovely out here? I imagine I'd feel a lot of regret if I turned down an opportunity to be in such a lovely location,
Colin said the next morning at breakfast. Lizbeth refrained from rolling her eyes. It is beautiful. Charlotte told me about her garden plans.
Yes, well, how is everything at school?
Much as you left it.
Your family is fine with you missing Thanksgiving?
My parents will be very busy all day today. Restaurants are very popular on Thanksgiving for people who can't get out of town. My father's restaurant is completely booked, and my mother has to help out.
We're going to do Thanksgiving on Saturday night.
I didn't realize your father was a chef.
Colin, I'm sure I told you that Lizbeth's father owns that restaurant Miss de Bourgh is usually raving about. Lizbeth watched as Colin processed this information, but he said nothing.
Lizbeth, please don't be mad, but I didn't tell you about our plans today, Charlotte said.
It won't be just the 3 of us here?
What?
Oh, no. I couldn't begin to think about a whole meal for Thanksgiving this year. No, we'll be having dinner at Miss de Bourgh's house.
And there will be more people than I led you to believe.
I'm here to spend time with you. The more the merrier? There are more people than you're expecting. The 3 of us, plus Anne, Catherine's daughter, and her nephew Christopher. Chris and Anne are Will's cousins. What I failed to mention is that Will will be joining us as well. Jane told me he was in New Orleans with Charlie and Caroline. Why is he here? There was a flood in their parents' house, so Caroline and Charlie went elsewhere for Thanksgiving. Will changed his plans after I invited you. Will his sister Jenny be here? No, she's in California with Chris's parents. I guess I'll just have to suck it up and deal. Is it rude to bring a book? Yes, Charlotte said with a smirk.
Don't worry about wearing something fancy, Lizbeth, Colin said. Just wear the nicest thing you brought.
Lizbeth wore a pretty V-neck purple dress and a black cardigan to Thanksgiving dinner. They drove up to the huge main house. Lizbeth knew the house from having spent much of her childhood in the area, but it had been vacant most of that time. Lizbeth decided not to mention that her family owned the other large property next door. Residents of the town fought to make sure that neither property would be broken up and sold to developers. People liked Gardner for its small New England town feel. Her grandfather often made comments about how people could move to Worcester if they wanted a big city. The house had a full staff for the day. Colin parked the car in the driveway, and a butler opened the door for them. Lizbeth could see maids carrying dishes and other items as they got organized for dinner. She suspected there was someone in the kitchen doing the cooking, and someone else hired to help with cleanup. The house seemed smaller on the inside. There was a grand staircase and a balcony on the second floor. In contrast to the ultra-modern and open feel to the cottage, this house was a typical New England colonial style, with separate rooms for the living room, dining room, and kitchen. The rooms all had dark wallpaper in plaids or brocades. The butler took their jackets and led them into the living room. The formal furniture looked as uncomfortable as it really was. "Colin, Charlotte, I'm so glad you've arrived. You're the last ones to get here. This must be your friend Lizbeth. I have heard so much about you from Colin. How wonderful to meet you," Catherine de Bourgh said, getting to her feet.
She greeted both Charlotte and Lizbeth with kisses on each cheek,
and Colin with a bear hug. "Now," she continued, "introductions." Catherine de Bourgh was not what Lizbeth had expected. She was a petite woman in her early 60s. She was dressed in a silk pink pastel pantsuit. The outfit complemented her jet-black hair and pale complexion, even if it was from a different decade. The older woman waved her hands around the room and introduced each person in order. "This is my daughter Anne, my nephew Christopher, and my nephew William." "Lizbeth and I know each other, Aunt Catherine," Will said. Will had been standing behind Lizbeth in a corner. He was dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, in black slacks, a shirt, and a black jacket. He wore no tie, and the first two buttons of his shirt were undone. She could see a smattering of chest hair where the shirt was open. He still sported his usual black chucks. Lizbeth felt like he should be wearing a bow tie, cummerbund. He had gotten a haircut since she had seen him a few days ago in class. Chris dressed similarly. She could see a small resemblance between the cousins. Chris's hair was a lighter shade of brown, and his eyes were hazel. The biggest difference was a scar on Chris's left cheek that became the focal point on his face. It didn't ruin his handsomeness. It just changed it. Anne de Bourgh was a thin, frail girl with jet-black hair, dark brown eyes, and pale skin. She was playing up the goth element with her clothing. She wore a black Victorian-style dress with long sleeves, a high collar, and black lace. She made Lizbeth think of Winona Ryder in Beetlejuice. "Really? How interesting. How do you know each other?" "We have a class together, and Lizbeth is the president of the Phi Alpha Pi chapter on campus." "I'm a sister as well, but at Boston University's chapter. Will's mother, my sister, was also a member. I expect Ginny and Anne will both be legacy members if there is a chapter at the school they choose." Lizbeth watched Anne roll her eyes. "Well, now everyone knows everyone. Please sit and tell us more about yourself, Lizbeth. It is so delightful to meet someone new. Where are you from? How did you end up in Georgia for school? What are you studying?" Lizbeth did her best to answer the questions thrown at her. She kept her answers brief, as Catherine kept asking her more than she could answer. "I grew up in Boston. I picked a school in Georgia to see another part of the country. I'm studying communications, focusing on gender communication online." "Do you have any siblings? What do they do? What about your parents?" "I have a younger brother, Josh, at Johnson & Wales in Rhode Island, and a sister, Becca, who is a senior in high school. My mother is a writer, and my father is a chef." "Oh, so you come from a very creative family. I feel a well-rounded woman is a balance of both creative and scholarly pursuits. Do you paint, sing, dance, or have any other artistic hobbies?" "No, I happen to be the least talented of my family. I had piano lessons as a child, but I've always been more of a reader and thinker." "You'll have to play something for us after dinner. Anne has a talent for the piano, so we have plenty of sheet music." "I really can't play at all." "Nonsense. There is no need to be modest. Speaking of the piano, William, how is Jenny coming along? Is she practicing enough?" "Lizbeth, I bet if you simply practice more, you will feel more confident about your talent," Catherine said. Lizbeth looked at Wil, and their eyes met briefly before he looked away. Ginny practices all the time. She loves the music and care packages you send to her, Wil told Catherine. Lizbeth, I'm shocked you look so healthy with a chef for a father, Catherine said, changing the subject. Lizbeth didn't know how to respond to being called not fat. Thank you, she said. What do you plan on doing with your degree once school is over in May? I'm applying to graduate schools, but my career plans aren't finalized yet. Part of me wants to stay in academia and teach. Another part of me wants to do work with social justice organizations and in social policy. None of that pays very well. I'd rather find joy in what I do than be wealthy. My parents taught me to do what I love. Well, writing and being a chef have never been that lucrative for career choices. I'm sure your parents are used to making financial sacrifices. Elizabeth turned to Colin, expecting him to share the things he had learned earlier, but he was busy eating all the little snacks left out. Charlotte was sitting back, quietly enjoying herself. It was clear nobody was going to correct the assumptions, so Lizbeth played along. What do you do, Chris? Lizbeth asked, trying to deflect the spotlight. I'm in law school in California. Have you picked a specialty yet, or are you still getting through all the required classes? I'm probably going to focus on estate or tax law. This knowledge is in high demand in our family. What would you do if it wasn't in high demand? Work with refugees and the immigration process for people seeking asylum from war-torn countries? If you ever change your mind, I have an uncle who used to do a lot of that before he became a lobbyist. What is your uncle a lobbyist for? Catherine asked. The American Library Association. Libraries don't have much money to hire lobbyists, Chris said. He does more than lobby for them, but he thinks the mission of libraries is critical to a free, democratic, and educated nation. It's not about the money for him. One of my aunts is an academic librarian, so this is a labor of love for him. It's his way to help his little sister. At dinner, Catherine turned her attention away from Lizbeth to Charlotte. The two talked about Charlotte's plans for the garden and what she could do this fall to prepare for spring. Lizbeth was placed between Anne, who had very little to say, and Chris, who was happy to chat about their shared interest in social justice. Wil was seated across from Lizbeth and next to Colin. Lizbeth could hear Colin's endless monologue. Wil was wearing the scowl Lizbeth was used to seeing on him. Are you going to play the piano for us? It is the sign of a well-rounded woman, after all, Chris said as dinner ended. Lizbeth had to laugh. Talking to Chris was like talking to a version of Wil with a sense of humor. Since you asked so nicely, how can I refuse?
You should know.
I can't actually play more than Heart and Soul and maybe Chopsticks. Don't worry, he said with a smile. I can't either. They returned to the living room after the meal. Chris pulled out the bench of the baby grand piano that was too large for the room. He motioned for Lizbeth to join him. She did just that before she started playing one part of Heart and Soul. Chris quickly came in with the other half of the duet. It didn't take long for him to forget the exact keys to play. With a laugh, Lizbeth changed to Chopsticks, which they both managed to play simultaneously. They laughed as Lizbeth lost her momentum and hit the wrong keys. Anne used to get piano lessons as a kid, Chris said. They had stopped playing and were sitting at the piano hitting random keys. Lizbeth was trying to think of any other songs she could actually play. My parents tried that too, but I have zero musical talent. You're much better than you let on, Wil said. Lizbeth looked up to see Wil standing at the far end of the piano. You're kidding, right? Lizbeth said. Maybe, Wil said with a rare smile. Lizbeth didn't know how to react. She had never heard Wil make a joke and couldn't recall him ever smiling. I came over to be involved in a conversation that wasn't about summer gardens or the myriad of opportunities my aunt is providing. Ah, so you're saying our core plane is better than an actual conversation? Lizbeth said. I am shocked you're seeking out any conversation. In my experience, you have some disdain for baser company. What? Wil dislikes baser company? Chris said. I suddenly want to know everything about how the two of you know each other. Your cousin, Lizbeth said, typically spends his time at frat parties sober and scowling. Rather than talking to the wide variety of women and men at said parties, he sticks with Caroline and Charlie. If the party is at his own house, he goes to his room and shuts the door to be alone. William, really? You're too good for a frat party? Chris said. When people get drunk, they tend to act foolish. Many of Lizbeth's sorority sisters have proven that. I often have other things to do, Wil said. Yet you don't seek out those who were sober. I'm rarely drunk at these parties and manage to enjoy myself. You never seem to like talking to anyone. What are the three of you doing? Catherine said, interrupting the conversation from across the room. Nothing, Aunt Catherine. We're discussing Lizbeth's lovely playing, Chris said. Well, if she practiced, she would be much better. Lizbeth, do you ride as well as you play? Horses? Of course. Much better. Good. Colin, the three of you will join us for a ride and picnic tomorrow. All the leftovers will be there, and you can enjoy the lovely pond on the other side of the property. On Friday morning, Lizbeth put on her jeans and was thrilled to be able to use her riding boots for their intended purpose. Having spent so much of her life on the land across the lovely pond, Lizbeth had ridden horses before she could walk. Her grandparents had a stable on their property, and Lizbeth was the only girl she knew who asked for a pony and got it. These days she often rode the lovely white mare her grandmother had purchased for her 18th birthday. Lizbeth had named the horse Windfola for Eowyn's horse in Lord of the Rings. She was hoping to get to ride Windfola before she went back to school. They arrived at Catherine's stable to find a variety of horses being saddled. 2 were being hitched to an old-fashioned carriage. Anne was sitting inside the carriage waiting, and the house staff was loading picnic baskets into the back. Today she was wearing a black lace veil and hat. Lizbeth smiled at Anne and waved hello. Anne returned a small wave, but stopped as soon as Catherine appeared. Colin, Charlotte, you should ride in the carriage with me, Catherine said, directing everyone to their place. Charlotte was not fond of horses. Lizbeth, you said you were a good rider, so I picked a horse for you, Catherine said. Lizbeth watched as a black Frisian stallion was brought out of the stable. I don't like your pick, Aunt Catherine. Captain Jack is too wild, Chris said. Lizbeth grabbed an apple from a bag waiting to be loaded into the carriage. She stood to the right of the horse, watched as he stamped his hoofs a few times, and waited for him to look her in the eyes. Once he was looking at her, she offered her empty hand and let him watch her walk over. When she was standing next to him, Lizbeth stroked his flank a few times and blew on his nose. When Captain Jack blew back, Lizbeth put the apple in front of his face. She felt his soft lips and tongue on her hand as he took the apple and chewed it. Lizbeth had watched her grandfather train wild horses. Before long, she was cooing sweet words into and scratching Captain Jack's ears. All right, Jack and I are ready to go, Lizbeth said as she put her foot in the stirrup and lifted herself into the saddle. Jesus, Lizbeth, I think you're the most amazing woman I've ever met, Chris said with a smile.
Lizbeth looked at Wil with what she imagined to be a look of self-satisfaction.
He was not wearing his normal scowl, but instead looked shocked. She turned to Charlotte and found her friend trying to suppress her laughter. Catherine de Bourgh was left speechless. Women like Catherine were the reason Lizbeth withheld so many details about herself. The more they thought they knew, the more they would try to use it to get their way. Isn't your friend Caroline an experienced rider, William? Catherine said when she got over her disappointment. I believe so, but I have never gone riding with her, Wil said, before turning his horse and riding ahead of them. Lizbeth rolled her eyes at the mention of Caroline and guided Jack to follow Wil. Lizbeth noticed that Wil had chosen clothes appropriate for riding, black riding boots, blue relaxed fit jeans, and a light blue plaid button-down shirt with a navy sweater. Over that, he was wearing a khaki-colored corduroy jacket. Chris was dressed similarly. He rode next to her, and they spent most of the ride teasing each other and racing to different points. Lizbeth snuck a few glances at Wil. The scowl had returned to his face. Lizbeth had plenty of practice of ignoring this version of him. She, Wil, and Chris got to the lake ahead of the carriage and let their horses rest. Have you met the people who own the other property?
Chris asked Wil as they looked across the lake. They are an older couple, but his family has owned it since some revolutionary general settled Gardner, Wil said.
Nobody our age over there? They have horses, but I haven't been around much to see anything else. They have the most beautiful white mare that nobody seems to ride.
I told Catherine to see about buying her, but she said they weren't interested. The wife has no social filter and was rather blunt about her disdain for her new neighbor, Will said. Lizbeth said nothing about the family across the pond, but was not surprised. Her grandmother hated people who used social graces to insult you to your face. Anne told me she'd seen teenagers there once, Chris said. She told me that too, but I haven't seen any. They're probably grandchildren. Will and Chris unloaded the carriage once it arrived and set up the picnic. Lizbeth had finished securing all 3 horses to a tree when Charlotte came over to her. Be careful, Lizbeth said. Charlotte kept her distance from Jack, but fed carrots to the other 2. I have been getting used to the horses since there are so many around. Your grandmother sent me a note to come over if I wanted gentler horses to get used to first. Did you take her up on the offer? I believe Windfuller needs a bit of attention. Not yet, but I can't tell Catherine.
She wants Windfuller.
Will just said something about that. He asked Catherine to make the offer. How sweet! He's fallen in love with your horse, too. What does that mean? Nothing at all. Lizbeth was confused by the smirk on Charlotte's face, but wasn't in the mood to ask. Is Catherine usually like this? Lizbeth asked. Looking to embarrass people? Yes. Only if she thinks she needs to regain the upper hand. You have the attention of her 2 favorite nephews. They're fighting over you. They aren't fighting over me. Will can't stand me. Charlotte shrugged her shoulders before responding. So you say, but that's not what she sees. You come here and you aren't as much of a stranger as she thinks you are. Then you claim Chris and Will's attention. She tries to make you look like a fool to make the 2 of them see your flaws, but you keep showing her up. You're modest about your piano skills. You're modest about your skill with horses. She wants to take you down. I can't wait to see her reaction when she learns where you're going tomorrow. Lizbeth brushed Captain Jack in silence for a moment. Is that why she mentioned Caroline? Lizbeth asked. Oh, she adores Caroline. She wants Will and Caroline together. They're perfect for each other. If you say so.
Catherine thinks Will and Caroline are basically a couple, even if they don't put a label on it.
What do you think? We can talk about that tonight. Lizbeth had a wonderful time at the picnic. The food was good and the company better than expected. On the ride back, Will quickly split off from everyone and moved at his own quick pace. Lizbeth and Chris took a more leisurely amble back. I get the impression you and Will don't get along very well, Chris said toward the end of their ride. That would be accurate. He really is a great guy. I don't know what happened between the 2 of you, but I think you should give him a second chance. When he likes someone, he's a very loyal friend. He must be different with people he likes as opposed to those he doesn't. I think, aside from being cousins, he's one of my best friends. His friends can count on him for help and support. Even at school, he manages to get his friends out of trouble. He was just telling me a story about it the other night. Oh, what happened? Charlie was dating a girl who didn't seem all that interested in him. People around her seemed to suggest that she was really interested in his money, not him. Will helped him back away from the relationship without embarrassing anyone. Lizbeth said nothing for a few moments. Are you sure he said Charlie? Definitely. Caroline asked Will for his help when Charlie couldn't see past his own infatuation. Lizbeth took a few deep breaths to keep calm. You know, I'm really tired. I'm going to go back to the stable and then walk back down to the cottage, Lizbeth said. Oh, okay, Chris said, looking disappointed. Lizbeth rode ahead,
leaving Jack at the stable with the groom,
and walked back to the Collins cottage by herself. She sat on the front step and waited for Charlotte and Colin to get back. She was so angry she couldn't focus. When they got back, Colin went down to the basement to do schoolwork. Charlotte and Lizbeth sat in the kitchen. Lizbeth told Charlotte what she had learned as Charlotte poured them glasses of wine. I was worried this was what had happened, Charlotte said when Lizbeth was done. Really? We know Jane. We know how conservative she can be. Other people don't always see it that way. She smiles a lot, but sometimes that comes off as insincere. Then add Mrs. C to that mix. At the Halloween party, she was in rare form. I can see how Caroline and Will may have misunderstood Jane's intentions.
Caroline spent more time with Jane than we did this semester. How could she not understand Jane better? Let's be honest about Caroline. She has her own motives. Being here for a few weeks has allowed me to understand Caroline better. She wants something very specific for her brother, and I don't think Jane was that something. You said you weren't surprised to know Caroline got involved in breaking up Jane and Charlie. Well, your instinct about her seems spot on. Did you think she had bad intentions? I never liked her, but I didn't interact with her often, Charlotte said. Lizbeth poured more wine into their glasses. What does Will get out of breaking up a couple that just needed more time? Lizbeth asked. I admit that I don't understand. Maybe there really is more between Will and Caroline than we know. Catherine would like that. I guess you want to leave tomorrow morning rather than have breakfast at her house? Do you mind? I'm going to see if Josh can pick me up on his way over. Lizbeth went to the guest room, packed her things, and called her brother to arrange a pickup for noon the next day. At 7 a.m., Charlotte knocked on the door to ask if Lizbeth had changed her mind about breakfast. I'll be back before you leave. I want to say hi to your brother before you go. There's bread in the pantry if you want toast, Charlotte said when Lizbeth declined. Lizbeth made herself a light breakfast and was reading at the kitchen table when there was a knock on the door. It was much too early for Josh to be there. She looked out the front window and saw it was a very anxious Will. He looked a mess, in a black peacoat. She was shocked to see that he was wearing black sweatpants and a maroon Harvard sweatshirt. His hair was a mess, as if he had just woken up and come down to the cottage. He was wearing his normal black chucks, but no socks. Will, Lizbeth said when she opened the door. Can I come in and speak with you? Sure. Lizbeth stepped back to allow him to enter. She led him into the living room and stood facing him, waiting for him to speak. He didn't say anything as he looked around the room. Lizbeth noticed that he was chewing his fingernails. Lizbeth crossed her arms and waited to see what he wanted. The cottage is lovely. Does Charlotte like it here? Very much so. I'm surprised at how happy she seems. They stood there in tense silence. Will kept scanning the room, unable or unwilling to focus on anything, and chewing on his nails. Lizbeth didn't know what to say next, but felt anxious to find out what he was so desperate to say to her. I don't think you came to talk to me about Charlotte's happiness, Lizbeth said, trying to get Will to talk. No, I have not slept very well, and I have something I want to say to you before you leave. I had hoped you would be at breakfast, but you did not show up. Well, you found me, so say what you want and leave. I can't resist my feelings any more. I'm in love with you and have been for some time. In spite of everything, I love you. You are not anything like the woman I expected to fall in love with, but no matter how hard I try, I can't get past my feelings. You are an aggressive, unconnected nobody who holds everyone up to ridiculously high expectations and acts like you're entitled to everyone's respect. You are also brilliant, funny, treat most people as if they're your equal, and stand up for what you want. Lizbeth stood there in shock for a moment. Then Will moved closer and kissed her. Lizbeth let the kiss go on longer than she should have. When he pulled away from the kiss, she slapped him. What was that for?
Will asked, as he put his hand to his reddening cheek.
First, you have no right to kiss me without my consent. Do you really think you've wooed me and made me forget everything you've done to me and the people I care about? What have I done that insults you so much? Will said as he rubbed his cheek. I heard you the first night we met. I was in that room and heard what you said to Charlie about me. What did I say? That I wasn't pretty and I was much too aggressive. I had just met you and you're very aggressive. You just slapped me for kissing you. Yet you've never given any indication that your opinion had changed. You've been unnecessarily curt and mean to me since then. I would never have interpreted any of your actions and words as your being in love with me. Then there is what you did to Jane, who is like a sister to me. Chris told me how you helped Charlie get out of a relationship with a girl who only wanted his money and didn't care about him at all. Your actions exposed the sweetest and most loving person I know to pain she didn't deserve. What did you gain from that? What about Jorge, and how he can't finish school because you've denied him the finances your father promised him? What did he ever do to you other than be someone your father loved? Will's ears turned red, and his jaw clenched. Is that all? Wil said. Isn't that enough? Nothing you say could ever convince me that you love me or that I could return those feelings.
You have made everything perfectly clear. I am sorry to bother you.
The two of them stood facing each other, fuming, until Wil left the cottage without another word. Charlotte came back to the cottage alone about 30 minutes later. Lizbeth had been talking to herself and pacing around the house. Lizbeth? Charlotte called when she walked in the door. Do you know what William Darcy did? Lizbeth said from the kitchen, where she was aggressively cleaning up her breakfast. I don't know exactly what he did, but based on what I saw when he returned with a brand new bright red palm print across his face, well, I have theories. He told me he was in love with me and kissed me. Lizbeth threw a sponge into the sink as she said this. I knew it! What? I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. I knew he was in love with you. Lizbeth stood there looking at her friend. Is that who you meant when you said someone was crazy about me? Lizbeth, there's no point telling you what you don't want to see. He's been in love with you since, well, at least since Halloween, but probably sooner, Charlotte said, walking into the kitchen. Does everyone already know this but me? Everyone who pays attention. Jane certainly does, and I suspect Caroline does as well. Chris, Anne, and Catherine probably knew it as soon as you got to the house this weekend. That's why Catherine has been trying to take you down a peg. This morning she didn't shut up about how amazing Caroline is. She was going on about it when we got to breakfast.
It was weird when we got there. Wil was fighting with Catherine. He looked like he didn't sleep, and everyone seemed anxious. When you didn't show up with us?
Wil just left. When he came back, it was clear he was not happy and that someone had slapped him. What did he say when he got back to the house? Nothing. He went right up to his room. He was muttering something, and Chris followed him. Catherine was not pleased, and said she hoped the departure of all this company would allow things to get back to normal. Lizbeth took a deep breath. Talking about it with Charlotte only made her more confused. You really knew how he felt? How did I miss it? The same way you missed how I decided against graduate school. The same way you miss noticing the good things Marie and Lydia do. The same way you miss that Jane and Charlie weren't clicking. Sometimes you don't see what's in front of your face, and sometimes you misunderstand what you do see. Wil's an introvert with social anxiety, and you're an extrovert.
The more I saw him, the more I understood why you seemed aggressive to him.
He doesn't have social anxiety issues. How would you know? He goes to parties all the time. He's clearly dragged to parties by his extroverted best friend. What was he like when you were working on that French project at the townhouse? The same as he always is. He would sit in the main room and work on his own stuff, ignoring us. Did you ever consider that he wanted to be where you were? He was never around me. He's usually around you. He looks for you at parties. He probably has no idea how to deal with an extrovert who isn't the center of attention, like how he ignores Lydia and lets others give Charlie the attention he needs. You aren't like that. You like being around people without having all eyes on you. Anyone paying attention can see that he worships you, and it scares the shit out of him. Lizbeth enjoyed her belated Thanksgiving with her family. She shared all her stories about Catherine. While her parents were concerned at her being so secretive, this was one time they enjoyed the outcome of these secrets. She slept well that night and was woken up the next morning by her sister Becca. Lizbeth, the most beautiful man has come to see you. Lizbeth opened her eyes to see her younger sister leaning over her. What? Someone named Wil? Her sister Becca asked. Did you not pay attention last night? No. Who is he? The nephew of the woman I spent Thanksgiving with. He's hot. He's miserable. Why is he here, and what time is it? It's 8 a.m., and he said Charlotte told him to come here to see you. He's looking a bit overwhelmed. Nana is talking to him. Lizbeth bolted out of bed. She loved her grandmother,
but she didn't want her talking to Wil.
She got dressed as quickly as she could and ran down the stairs to the large entryway of her grandparents' house. Wil and both her grandparents were standing near the door. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but her grandfather was talking. Wil looked like he hadn't slept.
He was dressed in jeans and a simple white undershirt.
His black pea coat and his black chucks. "Oh, Lizbeth, my dear," her grandmother said when she saw her on the stairs. "This young man came all the way over from Miss de Bourgh's house to see you. It turns out he thought you were staying farther away than the property next door." "Will?" "Lizbeth."
"My love," her grandfather said to her grandmother, "let's go see what our son-in-law has made for breakfast. I think I smell the British back bacon that we adore."
Lizbeth waited until her grandparents had walked away to talk to Will. "What do you want? Please don't tell me about how you love me." "No. I went to see you at Charlotte's, and she told me you had come here. This is your grandparents' house?" "Yes." "You live here?" "No, I visit here. You heard us talking about buying their horses." "I heard you talking about buying my horse." "The white mare is yours?" "Yes. Her name is Windfalla." Will tilted his head to the side. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. "So you could change your opinion of me based on my family's wealth, connections, and position in society? Why did you come here? What's so important?" Will handed her an envelope. "You said some very harsh things to me yesterday, and I felt the need to illuminate you about things clearly unknown," Will said as he handed her the envelope. He turned around and walked out of the house. Lizbeth stood in the open doorway, watching him drive away until he was out of sight. "He is the one you don't like?" Becca said from behind Lizbeth. "No, I don't like him at all." "Pity." Lizbeth went back up to her room with the letter. Brunch wouldn't be ready for a while. She looked at the envelope. It was high-quality stationery. Her name was written on the front of it in neat handwriting. A wax seal held the envelope closed. Lizbeth rolled her eyes as she broke it and pulled out 4 sheets of paper. The letter was written in the same immaculate handwriting, and each page was filled on both sides, all the way to the edges. Lizbeth felt overwhelmed at the idea of reading all of it. She was not going to let Will ruin her morning with her family, so she put it down and started to leave the room. She got to the door, but went back to her bed and picked up the letter again.
She didn't put it down until she was done.
"Lizbeth, I'm sure you put off reading this until you had no other option. I assure you I will not be reasserting my feelings for you, or expecting any response from you after you have read this letter. 2 of the charges you laid at my feet have left me feeling a need to give you a fuller picture of what has happened. My friendship with Charlie has been an important one for the last few years, since my father passed away. He has always accepted me as I am, flaws and all. What I value in him is also his flaw. He sees the best in everyone and can't conceive that anyone could have harmful motives. He is inclined to trust without discrimination. He has been hoping to fall in love. His wealth and nature make him an easy target for manipulative women. I promised Caroline that I would make sure nobody took advantage of him this year. I knew of Charlie's feelings for Jane almost as soon as they met. It was the sincerity of Jane's feelings for Charlie that remained unclear. The more I saw them together, the more I felt the intensity of his feelings far outweighed those of your friend. Her reluctance to spend time with him, or to speak her feelings, convinced me she wasn't as attached to him as he believed her to be, or as others, specifically your house mother and Lydia, communicated them to be.
I can admit that the behavior of people surrounding Jane did not improve my impression of her and the company she keeps.
For example, your house mother's inexplicable presence at the Halloween party. I know she is expected to be at sorority parties and events. The audacity of the woman to show up at our home for a personal party was irritating. What was unforgivable was her getting drunk and making a scene. What called Jane's motivation into question was Mrs. Collins' proclamation about how she had successfully helped Jane secure a rich husband. Both Caroline and I became concerned at that point.
I encouraged Charlie to take a step
back from his relationship with Jane and to focus on his schoolwork. Caroline promised she would speak to Jane personally. We agreed to stop spending time with our fraternity. If I wounded Jane's feelings because of my actions, it was unknowingly done. Still, I do not regret looking out for my friend, as you do for yours.
As for Jorge,
while I do not know the specific charges he has laid against me, I believe Jorge has misled you on a number of important points. Yes, it is true that we grew up together, and my father loved Jorge as he loved my sister Jenny and me. My father passed away when I was 18.
Jorge was 21, and Jenny was 14.
In his will, my father created a trust,
of which my uncle, my mother's older brother,
was executor.
The trust provided for Jorge's final year at the school of his choice. My uncle gave Jorge the option to take one lump sum or to leave the money in trust with an allowance and bills paid directly from it. Jorge chose to take the lump sum, and it was gone before the year was over.
He had withdrawn from all his classes and dropped out.
My uncle quickly lost track of him.
My sister continued to live in Manhattan to attend school. My uncle hired someone to live with Jenny since I was at school at Tulane. Jenny insisted she didn't need me to transfer to a closer school. I wanted to allow her the chance to learn independence and how to take care of herself. Approximately this time last year, I learned that my geographical distance had allowed Jorge to make my sister's portion of my family's estate the object of his desire. He had moved into our apartment when he needed a place to live. I came home early from school at the end of the fall semester that year. I wanted to surprise my sister with a trip for the holidays. I found that Jorge had taken out many credit cards in her name, maxed out the card's limits, and thus ruined her credit. She might be able to rebuild that, but it has shaken her trust, especially in men. I quickly arranged for Jenny to go to a boarding school closer to me and promised that I would transfer to a university closer to her. This is how I came to a new university in my senior year. I felt very fortunate to have Charlie's friendship, as he agreed to transfer with me without hesitation. We learned Jenny wasn't the first, and probably won't be the last, young woman Jorge has taken advantage of. He doesn't limit himself to young women. We have found middle-aged and older women that he has manipulated. He has convinced women to give him money from their savings, in addition to maxing out their credit cards for him and taking out credit cards in their names. I encourage you to check your credit just to be safe. My family can afford to hire lawyers to help my sister. I can only imagine the difficulty it has caused the other women. When I saw him here at our university, I promptly contacted our private detective, who was working with the police, both here and in New York, to arrest him. Lizbeth, this is the truth, and nothing but the truth, as to why I have no love for Jorge, and why I involved myself in Charlie's love life. I promise you I have not withheld anything. I know you may wonder why I didn't tell you this the other morning. Honestly, I didn't trust myself or feel I had the clarity of mind to be anything but angry. Still, if you think I'm still being biased and unfair, you can confirm all of this with Chris. He knows of everything that happened with Jorge, and as you clearly already know, I told him what happened to Charlie. I will end this letter here as I must deliver it to you. I will not bother you again. You will not see me on campus. Good luck with the rest of your year and with your thesis. William Darcy.